Our last video covered the Thraxian conflicts from 2479 to 2483, which provides some important context to this video's main focus, the West Alaxian War. It isn't necessary, but if you haven't seen it, I would highly recommend you check that one out first. In the decades following the end of the Thraxian conflicts, the Ceironia and Fazar governments would eventually apologize for their parts in the war, even offering money to help rebuild. However, as the many years passed and the country rebuilt itself, Thrax could never forgive Fazar. In the rhetoric of nationalist Thraxians, the strategic bombing campaign became a war of extermination, and 1 million casualties became several million. The fear of Fazar was put into the hearts and minds of most men, women, and children living in Thrax. Thrax would see itself hopping between several of the world's military alliances, eventually joining the Carcus-led Confederation of Allied Nations, alongside Fede, Lunador, Ginsukyo, and Atlantia, hoping that together these middling powers could resist the influence of the world's superpowers. In May 2500, Ceironia called the First South Sea Committee, a meeting between their own representatives and those from Fazar and the High Kingdoms. This meeting was to divide the moon into claims between these superpowers and their allies, in an attempt to preemptively block out any Sudanese attempt to establish a permanent base. But within 2 months, the SSC had grown into a loose alliance between Ceironia, the High Kingdoms, Fazar, and Azeri Bordo. In 2506, largely due to tensions from the Second Hiboy War, the formal agreement ended, though Fazar and Ceironia remained on relatively good terms with mutual rivals in Sutan and the High Kingdoms. 8 years later, in 2514, Ginsukyo would call a meeting with delegates from Thrax, Ginsukyo, and Atlantia, during which a Ginsukyan delegate would propose the terms adopted for the West Alaxian United Front, a defensive alliance between themselves, Atlantia, Thrax, and Ginsukyo. A few months later, on November 14th, bombs would go off in the Fazarian capital, Kassel, killing hundreds, including the only daughter of the then Prime Minister Brano Salgado. Devastated by the loss, Salgado would drop out of the 2515 elections, paving the way of the election of Prime Minister Raoul Hajar. While the attack was quickly pinned to domestic terrorists, many within Fazar believed the terrorists may have received funding from Thrax. Seeking to distance themselves from the attack, Thraxian delegates met with Hajar and the highlands of Pelagros. While the talks did prevent any further escalation and dissuaded the rumors of Thraxian involvement in the bombings, they did not improve Thrax and Fazarian relations much, with the Thraxians still viewing Fazar as a massive threat, and the Fazarians coming to believe that while this terrorist attack might not spark it, another war in Thrax was seeming more and more inevitable, leading to the military demodernization efforts in much of the DMSO, but especially in Jimaria and Fazar. In May 2519, the Thraxian government summoned Lunadorian delegates to the city of Osterkon. During the summit, Thraxian officials claimed that, quote, millions had died in the last war, and that Thrax was not prepared to face the next war again. The Thraxian delegates would also claim that, quote, Fazar will invade Thrax and the Western Alaxian region sometime during or after 2520. The Lunadorians were not entirely convinced, and refused to ask their allies in the Oikian Defense Accords to formally commit to a deployment of forces for the defense of West Alaxia. A year later, in May 2520, Ginsukyo withdrew from the WUF and petitioned to join the DMSO for, quote, diplomatic, strategic, and national security reasons. It was generally believed this decision also involved closed-door negotiations about the ethnically Avashiani regions of Ginsukyo and Atlantia near the Ginsukyan border, though there were certainly very real fears of Ginsukyo or Thrax that they would start a war that they could not win. A month later, Jamarian President Ayat Slad controversially ordered the deployment of Jamarian soldiers to the Ginsukyan and Thraxian borders, as he feared the Thraxian politicians' claims of a planned Fazarian invasion would be used to justify a preemptive strike. While Sloth would lose his re-election bid that July, his successor, President Urok Struik, would not remove the troops. In the same month, the Thraxian government sent a coded message to the ODA member states. Declassified, we know it read, quote, to the ODA members, a foreign enemy of the WF ODA, is going to start the invasion soon. We need as much volunteer support as possible, as the window is running out and the failure to defend the WUF will result in millions of deaths by the enemy in regards to war crimes, mass graves, forced labor camps, etc. We are losing. Please send divisions as soon as possible. Thank you. Only the Ceironian government would answer the plea, deploying the entire 1st Field Army to bases across Thrax. In April 2521, the Ginsukyo government announced mandatory military conscription would begin in July. In response, in June, the Jimarian government began encouraging enlistment, managing to raise 3 new Army Reserve Corps and beginning the withdrawal of Jimarian forced stations overseas. Meanwhile, Salgado was re-elected Prime Minister in 2520 and deployed a large force to see the defense of Tuzal in case of attack. 6 months later, on December 7, 2521, the Ginsukyo government would declare war on Fazar, launching a full-scale invasion of Tuzal. Despite some initial Ginsukyo gains due to the element of surprise, the numerically superior and better-equipped Fazarians soon turned the tide and over several days forced the Ginsukyo army towards the border, which the Ginsukyans were able to hold and fortify. Hours after the invasion had begun, Jimaria would declare war on Ginsukyo to support Fazar. Weeks later, on December 22nd, Thraxian forces attempted to seize the Ceironian military equipment. Presumably, this was because it was far more modern than the Thraxian equipment. The Thraxian military hoped they could use it to launch their own offensive against Tuzal. It should, however, be noted that throughout the war, the Thraxian government maintained that no such seizure attempt was made, and that Ceironian soldiers fired first. Whichever it may have been, the result was undeniably similar to the Alaxian War attack 42 years earlier, and the West Alaxian War had just truly begun. The Ceironian government conducted the largest cyber warfare attack in history, dubbed Operations Pros. The attack meant that within minutes across the whole WUF, rail was disrupted, pipelines were shut down, power grids were overloaded, telecommunications were jammed, satellites overheated, and digital banks were hacked. This would throw the nation's economy and infrastructure into total chaos. The Thraxian navy was quickly annihilated, its air force crippled, and the center of the nation rapidly occupied. The Ceironian army was substantially outnumbered, but much better equipped and better trained. And by January, the majority of the Thraxian territory was at least nominally under Ceironian control. Though this time, the capital city of New Dinsmark was successfully defended. Going into 2522, Jimarian Army Group North, under command of Field Marshal Tweak Khazdur, began a full invasion of Ginsukyo. Superior Jimarian equipment allowed them to overcome the Ginsukyan defenders, pushing the Ginsukyans to their rear defensive line between the cities of Tsiwa and McKees by the end of January. Worried about overextending the advance too much and risking supply issues, Khazdur ordered the Jimarian army to halt its advance and secure all the major roads and rail lines in its occupied territory. With the world believing that the fall of Ginsukyo and Thrax were at best months away, Fede, now the de facto leader of the Confederation of Allied Nations, launched a long-range missile strike which disabled much of the Ginsukyan navy, to definitely prove that the Confederation of Allied Nations no longer stood by their former allies in the WAUF. Fighting in February and early March largely boiled down to small skirmishes, before Khazdur ordered the Jimarian offensive to capture McKees. He believed that the Jimarian air superiority, armored superiority, and oppressive artillery batteries would allow the slightly numerically inferior force to overwhelm the city's defenders. But he proved incredibly wrong. Not only did the Ginsukyans hold their ground, the failed Jimarian assault proved very costly. So much so that the Jimarian government required citizens to sign up for the draft for the first time since the Great War. A second attempt to take the city in June was also proved a failure, prompting the first Jimarian conscripts to be sent to the front. August saw the poorly planned Atlantean air raid against the nearby Fazarian islands, which proved a total failure, with all Atlantean planes being shot down and only 2 confirmed Fazarian casualties. Shortly afterwards, a bomb would go off during a match at Yazga Stadium in Fazar, linked to the Thraxian Liberation Army. Tens of thousands of Fazarians would die, prompting Salgado to persuade Parliament to formally declare war on Thraxia, followed shortly by Jimarian declarations against both Thrax and Atlantia. Despite the Thraxian government denying any ties to the Thraxian Liberation Army, in Thrax itself, paramilitary groups would also ramp up attacks against Ceironian supply lines, forcing Ceironian troops to be redirected to guarding their logistics, instead of fighting the Thraxian army directly. On September 7th, Jimaria and Ceironia would launch the joint Operation Alkianus, taking much of northeastern and southern Thrax and dealing massive casualties to the Thraxian army. The Thraxian plan from then on was to hold defensive position around a handful of major cities, hoping that perhaps like last war, public opposition to the war would force their enemies to withdraw before their nation could be completely occupied. A third assault on McKees later in the month would see Jimaria secure total air superiority over eastern Ginsukyo, though once again the defenders held their ground. However, an attempted Ginsukian counterattack to retake the territory under Jimarian occupation also proved a total failure. By October, Atlantean reinforcements began to flood into McKees, even as Ginsukyo began to plan for the city's fall. A fourth failed assault on McKees in February saw Jimarian air superiority become basically unchallenged, as the more modern Jimarian Air Force destroyed dozens of Ginsukian planes without taking a single casualty. In March, as unprecedented numbers of Jimarian soldiers arrived to the front, a frustrated Marshal Hasdor vowed that by September, either McKees would fall or he would resign. It should be noted that at this point, his presumptive successor, General Ertuk Struhl, had been attempting to get President Struik to authorize a nuclear strike against McKees for some time. In May, Thrax surrendered unconditionally to Ceironia, Jimaria, and Fazar, freeing up much of the Jimarian army group south to assist in the attacks of McKees. In June, a fifth assault gained ground but failed to fully take the city, though by the end of July, McKees had fallen to the Jimarian army, dealing a crippling morale blow to Ginsukyo and Atlantia, who made the city's continued resistance a cornerstone of their wartime propaganda. At the end of July, Ceironia also managed to destroy what remained of the Ginsukian navy. Skirmishes would continue until September, when the Jimarian-led Operation Atradi saw a joint force push far west of McKees, destroying what remained of the Ginsukian defensive line and encircling Tsiwa. In December, Ceironian paramarines took the Ginsukian capital of Yendai. December also saw the large anti-draft, anti-war movement which had exploded in size in Jimaria begin to die down, as the string of victories and the end of the further conscription placated many opponents to the conflict. The invading coalition forces took the next months to consolidate until Ceironia began to launch renewed attacks in May 25-24, securing defensive victories. In June, Ginsukyo surrendered unconditionally to the Jimarian government, leading to a conference between representatives of Ceironia, Fazar, Jimaria, and Sinkaya, who had provided intelligence to the coalition throughout the war. Thrax was formally divided into 3 occupation zones and Ginsukyo into 4, with Sinkayan soldiers occupying a stretch of territory along the border. In July, Atlantia would issue their unconditional surrender as a joint Ceironian Fazarian army was gathering for a huge offensive to take the nation. Atlantia would also be divided into occupation zones between Fazar, Ceironia, and Sinkaya. With Atlantia's surrender, the war was over, and the borders of West Alaxia were redrawn. In August 25-24, Ceironia reorganized its occupation zones into 4 states based on its own government: the Atlantean Union, Ginsukian Union, the North Chiclarian Union, and the South Chiclarian Union. While theoretically independent, the Chiclarian Unions have still not held elections as of January 25-27, and even the Atlantean and Ginsukian governments are seen as little more than Ceironian puppet states. In June 25-25, Sinkaya would formally join the DMCO, and in December, the Sinkayan occupation zones were directly annexed into Sinkaya, marking the most direct territorial change. The Fazarian and Jimarian occupation zones currently remained under military occupation, though President Struik and Prime Minister Salgado are scheduled to meet in the future to discuss the possibility of merging their occupation zones into Atlantean, Ginsukian, and Thraxian government to rival the Union states. The war claimed over 1.3 million lives, with Thrax and Ginsukyo each losing over 500,000 soldiers and civilians. And that is how West Alaxia came to look how it does today. 2 wars waged and 3 nations broken. As well, there are movements to end the occupations and reunite the fractured former nations. There is no guarantee of success. Meanwhile, as Suton has grown increasingly isolationist, many believe a Cold War between Fazar and Ceironia is all but inevitable, as with fewer and fewer common enemies to unite them, it seems certain that 2 nations' ambitions will soon come into conflict.